Hi and welcome to an evening with the editors, giving you the political insight from Westminster, Holyrood and Brussels. My name's Kevin Schofield. I'm joined this evening by David Singleton, Dan Bond, Suzannah Brecknell, Mandy Rhodes, on the outside, Brian Johnson, and our special guest star this evening is former Assistant Political Secretary and Special Advisor to Tony Blair, Darren Murphy. We're going to start tonight, seems fitting since it's all we seem to be writing about at the moment, on Brexit. Now, I'm looking at you first, Brian, because you're hot foot from Brussels. Today, in particular, has been completely taken over, and the whole weekend, as it turned out, by Boris Johnson with his incendiary 4,000-word article in the Daily Telegraph, coming just days before Theresa May sets out her own vision for Brexit at the end of the week. How has it gone down in Brussels? And just give us an idea of how Boris in particular is viewed in the European Union.
I mean, I think one thing about Brussels is it's very much a working bureaucracy, and it's a less political animal than it is here in Westminster. So that's the first thing. So people view what's happening politically on Brexit slightly differently. But I think that the key thing, or the key reaction just before I came over here was, oh, not the Brits tilting at windmills yet again. Yeah? So, you know, what is Boris doing? We understand there's a home market, or certainly people in Brussels understand there's a home market that he's addressing here. He's also, it seems fairly obvious, he's putting his kind of hat in the ring in any future leadership competition or contest. But for everybody in Brussels, it's like, oh, you know, do we need more of this? What we really want is some down-to-earth negotiations, some professionalism. And Boris seems to come across yet again as perhaps a rather vain and flawed individual who's just self-seeking. Very little about Brexit, more about Boris.
Darren, obviously you worked for Tony Blair in Number 10. Had a cabinet colleague come out and essentially challenge the authority of the Prime Minister at that time ahead of a big, well-trailed speech, how would Tony Blair have reacted to what Boris has done?
I think it partly depends on at what point in his premiership it had happened, because I remember, I was in Downing Street at the time, seeing a split screen with Tony Blair on one side of it and Gordon Brown at the other, delivering slightly different speeches on exactly the same day at exactly the same time. There was supposed to be a grid that stopped that sort of thing happening. I think really what most professional politicians would take from the events of this week really would be about the lack of Boris Johnson's any ability that he has to be a team player, that it's really only ever about him. And I think that the truth is this is really about Conservative Party conference and the leadership of the Conservative Party. But this is too big an issue to be played out in a small party's membership of quite ageing people. This is about the future of the country. And frankly, I think whether people voted to stay or to leave, they should be quite angry about the games that are being played over it. It seems to me as though this is sort of like a Conservative Party parlour game rather than about the UK Parliament, about the politics of the country.
To be fair to Boris...
Brexit's not a game, sorry. Brexit's not a game.
No, exactly.
That's certainly true. Well, to be fair to Boris, he's come out today and said, you know, I'm four square behind the Prime Minister, you know, she's leading from the front. She helpfully has said, Boris, I'm leading from the front, just to make things perfectly clear. I mean, do we buy that? Do we think that Boris is, you know, if we're being fair to him, it wasn't a challenge to the Prime Minister, it was just Boris as a prominent Vote Leave campaigner setting out his vision?
I think it can be both, you know. I think it can be a job application and a bid to sort of set out his stall on Brexit at the same time. Interesting that he only mentioned Theresa May once in his 4,000-word article. It reminds me of a similar article that David Miliband put out in The Guardian a few years ago now when Gordon Brown was the Prime Minister, and he made the rookie error of not mentioning Gordon at all. Boris didn't quite do that. He gave one sort of dutiful mention to Theresa May.
In a 4,000-word article.
Yeah,
Squeeze in.
He's not completely stupid. He knows you've got to do that, but he did the bare minimum really, and I think this was very much a pitch to the grassroots Tory Brexiteers, I think, as much as anything else.
Yeah, I feel I sympathise with him a little bit. I mean, the timing was dreadful. First of all, I don't know what the thinking was there, but he's in a really difficult position in that anything he says is going to be seen through this lens of a leadership bid. Everything he says is going to be poured over for hidden meaning. But the guy's foreign secretary, and if he can't speak about the biggest foreign policy issue facing us, then what on earth is the point of having the foreign secretary in that position?
Ruth Davidson came out very quickly on Twitter and said, on the back of the terror attack at Parsons Green, this is a time for unity. It's not a time for sort of going off-piste. She didn't mention Boris by name, but it's pretty obvious who she was talking about. Yeah. I mean, what game is Ruth playing, do you think?
Well, Ruth follows her own... she's going in her own direction, but I just wanted to come back to Boris Johnson to say, the Prime Minister dismissed it as Boris, it's just Boris just being Boris, and Amber Rudd described him in terms that she was talking about a Labrador. I mean, this isn't just the eccentric behaviour of somebody that we think is a funny national treasure. He is the Foreign Secretary, and he also then has been criticised for using a statistic that became very inflammatory during the campaign.
Just to go back on Ruth, she's probably a kingmaker in the next Tory leadership contest. She's the most successful Tory politician electorally of recent times. She's a Remainer. She's a Liberal. She's very much in the Amber Rudd camp, I'm sure. I think the two of them were seen chatting and drinking in somewhere or other a few weeks ago. It might have been a few months ago. She doesn't want Boris to be the next leader. She wants it to be Amber Rudd.
Just to get away from Boris, eventually, on the wider approach of the UK government to the Brexit discussions thus far, I mean, how is it being viewed in Europe? I mean, we get a sense over here that there's maybe a bit of exasperation at the lack of progress or a lack of strategy almost from the government. I mean, is that an accurate representation of how things are viewed in the Commission?
I think, yes, certainly within the negotiating side of the European Commission, I think there is this, what is going on here? We need some progress. However, I don't think there's any real appetite to punish Britain. That doesn't exist. The EU is looking after the EU 27, not really worried about punishing one ex-member or one soon-to-be ex-member. So it's very much the case of you've brought this on yourself, you've asked to leave, here is the price to pay. You might not like that price, but that's the price. Now, we're willing to negotiate. But and certainly from talking to people within the UK side of things like the institutions, they feel very much that they've been left to their own devices. When there's a fountain of knowledge there from MEPs, from civil servants working in institutions that could have been used, that could have helped the negotiating team, but there is a sense that they just feel abandoned, that their knowledge is worthless, and that the government seems hell-bent on going down an aggressive, as you said, line, a Dunkirk spirit type battle that doesn't exist. It really doesn't exist.
What would they be looking for, do you think, from this big speech that Theresa May is making on Friday? Because it seems that a lot seems to be riding on this. The discussions thus far seem to have kind of run into the ground. There's a real sense of stasis almost. We're not making much progress.
I think commitment is the word. I think a commitment. It's not necessarily about the money. It's about having a commitment saying we will get past this impasse. This is what we want and we're willing to negotiate, because at the moment it's more a case of this is what we want, and if we don't get it then we're going to throw our toys out the pram. And that's not a negotiating stance. But I think what you said, David, is really interesting. There's a lot of people saying, to me, because I'm Scottish, what's happening in Scotland? I say, well, I'm not 100% sure, but I know we're not pro-Brexit, really. But if there are kingmakers like Ruth Davidson, and there's a kind of feeling, Mandy, in Scotland that, you know, there's a powerful Remain community, and we know, you know, it was a very close vote in the referendum. People in Brussels are very interested to see what they're going to do next.
So it wasn't a terribly close vote in Scotland. It was, you know, 62%, I think it was, for Remain. I think in Scotland what's interesting is you were talking about the negotiating abilities and this feeling that they're not listening. I think that's also the feeling in Scotland. So there is a vehicle in a devolved nation, or devolved nations, with the Joint Ministerial Committee, and that has been meeting. But from what I'm being told by certainly Scotland's Brexit minister is that you walk into those negotiations and the UK government is not listening. So you now have a position where Scotland and Labour-led Wales are working very well together. There's now a cross-party, I'm told, group being set up in Scotland under the auspice of Mike Russell, with Jackson Carlaw, who obviously works very closely with Ruth Davidson, to actually look at what they can do to work together to make sure that if they can press for amendments in the legislation that comes forward, that there might be some agreements on it. So there is work going on, and there is some consensus. And in Scotland, of course, there's been a paper that's been very well received elsewhere.
This is the one,
Scotland's Place in Europe.
saying that Scotland could maintain market access?
Well, it puts various options, and it's talking about the UK as well, and it was talking about single market access. And some of the suggestions within that paper have been picked up by the UK government and have certainly been picked up by the Welsh government. I think the feeling always in Scotland was if the SNP government are producing something, there must be a hidden agenda in there for independence. And actually, I think they were quite genuinely coming forward with some suggestions that might work for the country as a whole.
What happens, do you think? Last week we had the withdrawal bill, the EU withdrawal bill, the repeal bill as it used to be called, getting second reading. Now that needs legislative consent in the devolved administrations, but clearly the government is not going to allow the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Assembly to halt Brexit. What happens, do you think, if for the first time ever, I think it would be, the UK government was to just ignore what the Scottish Parliament does, assuming the Scottish Parliament was to reject the bill? I mean, what
I think they have said they will, because the SNP government have said they will, and I think
unless
Labour has supported. Unless comes back to this group that might be working.
So
what
happens
something.
Then? Is there a massive outpouring of anger and not very much else?
I don't know. I mean, you know, the bottom line was that there was a Remain vote in Scotland, and there was no appetite for independence. There was no huge outcry and no kind of rush to do something. I feel there's a sense everywhere of, let's wait and see what happens. You know, everybody's in the same boat. Nobody knows where we're going with this. So we're all feeling frustrated. But what do you then start protesting about?
Also, you're assuming that the British Parliament can pass that piece of legislation. I think given what happened on second reading, given the opposition in the House of Lords, the opposition in the House of Commons, frankly, I think it would be very interesting to see if that's possible to get that through. I don't think the government is very confident that it can get a piece of legislation through unless it's very heavily amended. And people who, for years, argued about the government taking these so-called Henry VIII powers to itself are today having to stand up in Parliament at the dispatch box and make the case for what is certainly the most draconian set of powers being taken by an executive in modern times. So, in peacetime, it's unheard of.
Isn't that what the EU was guilty of?
Apparently.
Stealing the powers?
It's all about parliamentary sovereignty, Brian. Don't forget that.
All the voters in Northumberland know exactly about parliamentary.
But if the bill wasn't to pass, that would mean that Labour would need to vote against it, which is obviously surely a huge gamble in Labour voting areas, which also voted leave. I mean,
well, they've got the benefit at the moment of it only being second reading and committee stage, and saying that they think that when it comes to the final vote, they haven't said that they're going to finally oppose it at third reading because they believe that they'll be able to amend it.
Yeah, I mean, what do we think of Labour's position, constructive ambiguity, whatever you might want to call it? I mean, they're trying to be all things to all people.
It's becoming less ambiguous by the week, to be fair.
I mean, where do you think it's going to end up? Do you think
I think Labour will.
Brexit?
I think Labour will vote against this particular piece of legislation. I don't think that's the same as voting against Brexit. I would like the Labour Party to vote against Brexit if it ever gets back to the House of Commons. I certainly think that it's all very well to say some seats voted in one direction, some vote the others. In the end, you elect a member of Parliament, not to go there as some sort of delegate, but you elect members of Parliament to go there and actually give a lead to public opinion, not follow it. And I think since the referendum, there's been one other far more important democratic event, and that's called the general election. And you have a government that said, we need a really strong negotiating position, give us a bigger majority, and they had the majority taken away. I think,
which they haven't accepted.
No, they haven't. But then, I mean, the idea that you can somehow say we have to restore all this parliamentary sovereignty for the UK, and we, rather than the EU having these powers, and then say, well, we can't really let Parliament actually express an opinion. We can't have a degree of balance in the chairmanship of select committees. I mean, it's a very odd situation to be that clearly the House of Lords won't vote for certainly the third reading of that act. I have no doubt about it. It certainly wouldn't vote for anything like withdrawal bill if it means withdrawal from the single market.
But voting down this bill, it might not actually stop Brexit, but in practical terms, it will make Brexit.
Pitched as that. I mean, in their papers, by the Brexiteers, I think it's having the courage to, as an MP, to. You're absolutely right. It's representative. They should be going there to lead opinion. But I think we've seen very few of them actually doing that and standing up. They're so enthralled to the will of the people. For whatever reasons.
Whips anyway.
Yeah, and let's remember Corbyn, when he was asked how enthusiastic he was about Brexit during the campaign, I think he gave it 7 out of 10.
Well, no, that was the EU.
That was it. Yeah.
The EU was 7 out of 10. Yeah. And some people seem to think that his heart wasn't in the campaign.
Well, it wasn't.
I have no idea with that.
But I mean, I think what this really shows, the whole of the conversation that we've had, is that, let's be clear, the people who are now running the government are people who were running the campaign to leave the European Union, with the possible exception of the Prime Minister. Those people have dealt themselves an unplayable hand. You cannot leave the European Union and stay in the single market and get rid of the freedom of movement. That is not that option isn't anywhere on the table. And to be fair, the British government's not even asking for that, because it's not asking for anything. No. There are a whole series of discussion papers that have been published, which they don't really set out the British government's position. They set out perhaps you could do this, perhaps you could do that. There's no real meat on any of this. I mean, even down to how the border in Northern Ireland will work is essentially, let's not really have a policy. I mean, it's a very odd negotiating process. And I think increasingly what you can see is that certainly the politicians in Britain don't really have a negotiating position worth the name. I mean, they don't have any negotiating skills. And I think that's partly where we've got to with the impasse in Brussels, in that you have negotiators on the EU side waiting for Britain to put a position, not a set of it could be this, it could be that, it could be something else.
It's very undefined. There's no specifics. It almost feels that even if some British negotiators, Davis or whatever, but he came over and said, "Look, we want everything. That's what we want." Well, okay. Right. Well,
at least it's a starting point.
Yeah, starting point.
It isn't a starting point. There's, we thought about maybe, perhaps, putting on a paper, maybe possibly doing this. Oh, what the TikTok.
It also goes back to what we were saying before, though. That, when you're talking about Labour politicians going back to their constituencies and actually showing some leadership, it was about why people voted the way they did. So we're still not discussing that. We're still not talking about the immigration issues that won't be solved by Brexit.
For
and,
sure.
Interesting talking about Ruth. Ruth puts out a paper about let's talk about immigration. That will be something that people will then have to sit and talk about once we get to the end of it, because it won't be a solution to that problem.
And for all the abuse that Tony Blair gets for expressing an opinion about anything, he went and had an article published saying, well, maybe if we talked about freedom of movement, to think about it not being anyone can come, but anyone who has a job first can come. you don't get sort of attacked for expressing an opinion. We have a government that won't express an opinion on anything.
But why wasn't that argument made during the referendum campaign? I'm amazed that wasn't made, because it was, you know, migration just...
Because everyone tiptoes around it.
Campaign, and that's a pretty strong argument, I would have thought.
I think it's Pandora's box, Kevin. People are scared to talk about that issue. And I think you're right, the Labour Party was stunned, I think, by the referendum vote and by this belief, whether real or not, that its traditional voters kind of voted against them, though they were confused as to what Corbyn, you know, he's 77 out of 10. But now they're scared to put their head above the parapet on Brexit, because they think, oh my God, everybody at home hates Brussels. But maybe they don't. Yeah, maybe they would just...
I mean, it's going back over old ground, isn't it? But I mean, the bottom line is the referendum was... a lot of the campaigns were based without any fact at all. So had those arguments been made more strongly, perhaps the result would have been different.
I think, well, a lot's resting on Theresa May's speech in Florence, isn't it? I mean, we were saying we want a position from the UK, we want someone to go out there and actually negotiate and speak to Brussels. And so that's going to be the crux point. Is she actually going to come up with some positions? Is she going to show this leadership to have a discussion with the public, or is she just going to be more kind of buying time and filling time with her speech?
Yeah, it feels again like she's just buying time. There's been no movement since her Lancaster House speech in January.
And as you say, since then we've had a general election which didn't go the way she wanted it, and the clock is still ticking down to the 30th of March.
I mean, do people here think that David Davis is not up to the job, or do you think that he's not got a strong enough mandate?
David Davis said in the Commons, and it was one of the more revealing comments that there's been on this subject recently, that nobody ever pretended that this would be simple or easy. Of course.
Well, apart from Liam Fox.
Liam Fox and John Redwood have said exactly that, almost word for word.
Not just easy, it's the easiest deal. The easiest deal ever.
Just
it's a pretty big red flag.
Just to wrap up this segment of the discussion, without wishing to sound like Noel Edmonds, do we think there'll be a deal or no deal by the end of the process? Deal or no deal?
No deal, I can't.
That does sound exactly like Noel Edmonds.
That's what I've thrown a
I think there's a deal, but that deal could bring down Theresa May.
Suzannah?
I think there's a shaky deal that will be sold as much better than it is.
Mandy?
Well, there'll just have to be a deal.
I think.
I don't think Brexit will happen.
Interesting.
I don't think the government has the votes.
Brian? I
don't think it will happen either.
Interesting. Oh, we shall see. I'm quite surprised some of those answers actually. But anyway, so we're now about to move into what's like Christmas time really for political anoraks.
Without the presents.
The party without the presents, or there's quite a few turkeys. But anyway, the party conference season, currently in the middle of the high tension debates of the Lib Dem conference right now. Vince Cable seems pretty secure in his position, I think. Then we've got Labour at the weekend, followed by the Conservatives, followed by the SNP. Starting off with Labour, we're told that there's going to be hardly any debates led by shadow cabinet members, which is quite unusual. You're only going to have, I think, a few sort of keynote addresses from the likes of, obviously from Jeremy, but from John McDonnell, Diane Abbott, one or two others.
Angela Rayner's one will be.
Angela Rayner, whereas Sadiq Khan, who obviously won in London Mayor, Andy Burnham, Manchester Mayor, they're not going to get to speak. I mean, is this Jeremy's way of trying to sort of see off any potential rivals to his position, do you think?
Well, it does look a little bit like it, doesn't it? And I remember last year after Sadiq's speech, I think he was widely praised as, I think, the best speaker of the conference, and, you know, kind of a leader in waiting and the guy that could step into Corbyn's shoes. And who knows whether that all that coverage influenced what Corbyn was thinking. But it does feel a bit like that. But, you know, I'm not sure if it's going to be a huge loss to all of us, because the speeches on the main stage can be pretty dull. I remember at Tory conference last year, I think ministers were pretty much banned from saying anything interesting at all. There was very few interesting speeches on the stage. So, you know,
It was
also, is that entirely fair? I mean, we don't say, why are the Tories not having the mayor of somewhere or the leader of a council speaking?
Well, they might,
just because Andy Burnham and Sadiq Khan are big names and we know who they are.
But also
they're the only Labour people in position.
But is it fair to then say that he's trying to dull?
No, I don't think he's trying to silence them so much as I think this conference is going to basically be just a victory parade for Jeremy Corbyn.
It's the first one he's had in the last few years without a contest.
But in a year where there's been major terrorist attacks in Manchester and a series of terrorist attacks in London, it is outrageous that the mayors of those cities, both of whom are Labour and both of them won, unlike Jeremy Corbyn, it's outrageous that those people aren't being invited, not just to speak, but really actually being the core of the conference, where Labour's in power.
Shown exactly as where Labour is in power. This is where Labour can make it govern.
The counter-argument that Jeremy's team would say is that what they want to do is give more airspace to ordinary party activists and members. The membership has risen exponentially under Jeremy's leadership. That's got to be a good thing, surely, letting the members, the ordinary sort of party foot soldiers, speak their mind. Surely that's it.
As I said earlier, one of the tasks about politics, of course, is to involve the public and involve members of political parties. But more important than that, it's about leadership. And actually, that means you want to hear from the people who you've selected and elected to be leaders of your own local party or leaders of your own city, and certainly members of Parliament who have a leadership job to do. I remember, I'm old enough to remember, that you had a whole series of very important speeches being given from the floor of the conference by members of the cabinet and the shadow cabinet, and the conference is being totally dominated by extremist, hard left delegates from the constituencies. I remember Dennis Healey having to make a famous speech about what had happened in 1978-79. I mean, it is silly for the Labour Party to go back to a party conference which is less like a professional political event and more like essentially a rabble-rousing.
Except the key shadow members are speaking.
Well, the hard left ones are, yes.
I mean, we're also old enough to remember people being thrown out from the floor of a Labour Party conference, aren't we? Ordinary members.
Are we?
Yeah, I am.
Don't remember that. But that's a fair point too. But I do think ultimately, if what you really want to do is to say this is an alternative government that is, ready to take up the reins of power in a hung parliament, it's pretty strange that you don't actually try and have most, if not all, of your shadow cabinet saying something. Certainly, the key spokespeople setting out the programme on health or education, crucially the economy, which I think will be covered on. But it's very odd, and I think the problem is it demonstrates that this Labour isn't any longer a political party that thinks of itself as an alternative government. It's just a collection of sort of hard left activists.
So after that, that seems like it's going to be fun, by the way.
I'm not going now. No, I said that.
There also is a leadership contest, of course, going on within the Labour Party.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Will they be Richard and Anas?
They'll have a platform of some kind, I would think. Yeah.
They'll both get speeches at Scottish Labour Party, you'd imagine, at the evening, right?
You would think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Sorry, Kevin, what will the key message be from Corbyn and from the conference?
I think it's one more heat.
One more. That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah.
That's always worked before. Not
one more heat.
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be, as far as I can see, any attempt to analyse why they didn't win the election.
Because they've convinced themselves that they did.
To tweak the platform that they stood on. It
is
one more heave.
There's no attempt to win over any Tory voters that didn't that got away last time around.
Nor any Labour voters who didn't vote Labour.
It's not entirely clear where the extra voters are going to come from. We'll find that out. But I mean, I do think what is interesting about this sort of the changing nature of Labour conference, and having been for years, traditionally the sort of the opening night of Labour conference, Sunday night, is you go to the Progress rally and all the thrusting Blairite moderates are there, sort of saying what they're going to do and how the party needs to move forward, and sort of parading their ambitions, and you can look and see who might be the next leader of the party and what great ideas they've got and how they're going to modernise the party and move it forward. You look at the Progress rally this time. There's, I think, Stella Creasy is there and a few others. There's really no point going. It's a bunch of MPs who haven't got a cat in hell's chance of being leader now, and they can't really influence policy at all. Whereas you have an alternative event where all of the Corbynistas are lining up to speak, and that's, as a journalist, I'll certainly be going to that one. What's the point of going to the Progress one?
Ed Miliband is even going to be at the World Transformed.
Russell Brand?
He's going there, yeah.
Russell Brand's going to be there.
At least they're in the same place at the same time. That's helpful.
I don't think Corbyn was ever at the Progress rally, and then he become a leader.
No. I think there are some
people saying he didn't have a cat and chance of hell.
I think there are some people who previously may have spoken at Progress events who are at the Momentum.
Yeah, well, Chuka Umunna is famously the only person that spoke to the Progress event and the Compass event at the same conference.
I remember that. I remember going to both of those events.
Yeah.
Chuka spoke at both. Yeah, he was keeping his options open, I think. Yeah, sort of classic Chuka style.
Yeah.
So then we're on to the Tory conference. I mean, is that just going to be a Tory beauty contest, you think? Is it people jockeying for position to take over from the Prime Minister when she goes, although she says she might stay on?
I think, as David said, now that after this week and after Boris's intervention, everything he says will be poured over. It'll be really interesting to see how people react to Jacob Rees-Mogg, whether he keeps his head down or... Well,
we found out at the weekend he's speaking about 9 different things. I mean, his diary's chock a lot. He looks like he's sort of up to something.
Equally interesting will be seeing if any right-wing MPs actually say anything nice about Jacob Rees-Mogg, because his problem is that he hasn't got any MP support, and as we know, you need the MP support to get into the final 2. There's no MPs that have come out to bat for him, so as well as watching Rees-Mogg to see what he says, if any right-wingers come forward and say, Jacob will be a great PM,
I don't know how right
that'll be very interesting.
He hasn't got any. Rees-Mogg outrider.
I mean, are the Tories concerned not so much about who the leader will be, but actually winning the next election? Is there any sense of foreboding there, or because some statisticians I talked to are saying, the Tories are going to get wiped out at the next.
It depends, I suppose, when the election comes. But I think we're going to come on to that a little bit later. But next up is going to be the SNP comms. Now, what I find interesting about that is that Nicola Sturgeon has got to tread a bit of a fine line between not scaring those who are still not convinced by independence, reassuring those who maybe are not best pleased with how they're running the Scottish Government, but also at the same time keeping her activists on board who want independence and another referendum as soon as possible. And thus far, she's just about managed to ride both those horses at the same time. How's she going to do it this time? You know her pretty well. How's she going to do it this time?
We were talking earlier, and I was saying, I think she was right, and it was astute after the Remain vote in Scotland after Brexit to come out and say that this puts independence back on the agenda. And she was undoubtedly wrong-footed by a snap election that none of us could have predicted. And you're right, she now has to balance all of those things, because the SNP, shock horror, are a party of independence. They're not going to shelve independence. She's not going to do that. But she's also a gradualist, like many in the party that have led it. I think she manages to get that argument over to the activists, because the bottom line is, unless the SNP are the party of government, there will not be an independence referendum. So it doesn't matter how disgruntled you may feel about current situations around education, etc. If you want independence, you need them in government.
And it's interesting that the party that's growing in Scotland is the Conservative Party.
Well, on what basis, though, Dan?
At the last election.
Well, and then you now look at the YouGov poll of the other day, and also research being done by Edinburgh University that shows at least a third of those supporters are not Tory voters, and it was a protest vote. So it's a really fragile vote that Ruth's going to have to work very hard to keep. And this is where I think the problem for Nicola is. If Richard Leonard, who's up for the Labour leadership, and he is seen as a Corbyn man, if he gets it, does that mean that Nicola starts to think the SNP should go to the left while Ruth takes the centre ground? You know, and I think Nicola would be wrong to go to the left. I mean, if you look at the last election, and on the basis of what you were saying, the vote that went up for the Tories, Scotland's not this radical hotbed of left-wing politics.
I never thought that.
You know, I think that will be her dilemma, how she pitches the SNP.
We talk about Jeremy making sure that Sadiq and Andy Burnham aren't on the platform. Will Nicola try and make sure that Alex Salmond's nowhere to be seen?
No, and I have to say, I think Alec isn't a problem for Nicola.
Do you not think?
No, I don't. And I think his recent interventions talking about other arrangements you could make out with the EU haven't been helpful to her. But she, and I know this, she does not find him unhelpful. Even
when he's making inappropriate gags?
Well, did anybody, you know, my worry about that is that us in the media have a particular view about Alex Salmond. And it was OK for Ruth Davidson to give a speech to journalists where she talked about withdrawing a large Johnson and having post-coital cigarettes, etc. Alex Salmond says something and the world goes mad. I mean, you know, there are different measures here about what we think is appropriate.
I do remember us writing that story when Ruth said... I
don't think we criticised. I think it was... the media found that all very funny.
Ruth Davidson wowing the...
Bit of a lad, you know, and everyone loves it,
Now, looking forward to when the conferences are over, which will be a high point for all of us, I think, when they're finally out of the way. We'll come back, I guess, and start talking about when the next election is going to be. The more MPs that I speak to are now increasingly of the mind that it's not going to be until 2022. Is that... Do you think that's right? Because, I mean, after the last... We were all convinced on the night of the last election in June that there'd be another one either October or next spring. I mean, is that now in the table, do you think? Yeah,
I think in the first week after the election, a Tory MP said to me that every day that passes, Theresa May will look more and more secure, and the likelihood of her reaching 2022 will continue to increase exponentially. And I think that's going to prove to be true. So if she lasts 9 months, she'll last 5 years. And I think that is being increasingly sort of borne out.
Isn't there a difference between her lasting and there being an election? I mean, I agree that I don't think there will be an election until 2022.
Yeah.
But whether she's the leader...
Because even if...
But then you talk about who's the leader. But
well, even if the election is going to be 2022, assuming that Theresa May isn't the Prime Minister that takes the party into that election, surely there need to be some kind of transition period, to coin a phrase, that a new leader would need to come in a year, maybe 2 years beforehand. So you're looking at maybe 2020 for her own sort of political shelf life.
And remember, I will always bring in the Scottish perspective, but there is a Scottish election the year before that, which also then becomes an issue.
And that can't change. No. That's got to be 2021.
Yeah. So if you had a new leader of the Tory party in 2020 and you're going into a Scottish election in 21, and then you've got something else in 22, they all feed into each other these days, don't they?
Yeah. Who do you think will be leading the parties into the next election then? If we're assuming that it's not going to be Theresa May.
Yeah. I mean, Boris and
start off with the Tories.
Boris and David Davis are the front runners, aren't they? Davis is interesting because his pitch is really he can hit the ground running on Brexit, and he can potentially unite the extreme right Brexiteers and the sort of soft Brexiters. He's a sort of, he's a Brexiteer, but he's arguably not in the mould of Boris and Liam Fox and that lot, and he could be more pragmatic. So that's his pitch, but
he's also 68 and will be he's around about that, isn't he?
He's getting on. Which
70's is the new 40.
But so is Jeremy. But you know, his pitch expires once Brexit has been achieved. Really, what's the point of David Davis? Really, he's not.
Especially as
not as much to offer.
And especially if I was
going to say, especially as it seems like she's going to be trying to sideline him. I mean, one of the responses to the Johnson over the weekend was her moving her top official from DEXU back into her under number 10. So the guy, Ollie Robbins, who's running the negotiations from the official side, now is more directly into her. So that seems to me like she's trying to sideline Davis and say, well, I take over from here, I do this, and he just sort of sits on the sidelines until Brexit happens, and then what has he done? What does he do next? So I think she's trying to undermine him in that way as well.
Do we buy into this theory that what will happen is they might skip a generation, and that this generation of Tories, the current cabinet, maybe apart from Amber Rudd perhaps, they will be viewed as sort of yesterday's men and women. It might be somebody from the 2010 or 20.
Yeah, I think particularly if the next leader doesn't come in until after March, April 2019, after we've left the EU, there's a strong case to draw a line under that.
Because the theory I've heard is that keep Theresa May in place until 2019, let her see Brexit through, and then she can take all that sort of ill feeling with her, because it's not going to please. It's not going to please the Remainers. It's not going to please the Brexiters. There's going to be too many compromises for them.
You don't have
so you need a fresh skin.
Yeah, but it's quite difficult to see any sort of clean break, because there will be a chunk of members of Parliament on the Conservative benches who are very unhappy with what's been negotiated. And like it or not, it will be Theresa May who gets blamed for that. And then it will be, well, it's because we had a Remainer as the party leader, and you'll be having a bit of a pushback from that. So I think it's difficult to see the circumstances at all that delivers a clean break.
It's not happening though, Darren, is it?
No, but no, I don't. Which makes it even more uncertain. I think that in those circumstances, what would happen, I think, is that when the legislation is rejected by Parliament, I'd imagine that the Prime Minister would have to resign. It'll probably be on that timetable, actually. It doesn't make much difference. The real question is, does she take David Davis and Boris Johnson with her in those circumstances? Because essentially the Brexit argument will be lost.
And if that happens, would there not then be the proper opportunity for Corbyn to have a vote of no confidence in the government and then prompt an election?
He could, but I don't think that that's likely. I think there may well be a vote, but I think the confidence and supply arrangement with the DUP will probably survive.
Because the last thing the Tories want
is another election.
But they need to find a leader that they could agree on. I mean, if Labour have a,
there's the rub.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I mean. I think it's very difficult to have
in a Prime Minister that doesn't exist.
I think from our perspective across the water, is we're all very interested in the Remain Tories, who are being very quiet at the moment, and they're biding their time. What are they going to do in a few years' time? How are they going to react to situations as they develop? And as a leader of the Tory party, could they come from could they actually be a Remain leader? And as we are suggesting, somehow Brexit switches to.
I think that's the interesting what would happen to Hammond in those circumstances, or Amber Rudd for that matter.
But assuming it was a contest and not a walkover like it was last year, and it was chosen by the Tory activists, are they going to? Who are by and large leavers? Are they going to want to have a Remain leader? Surely the next leader's going to have to be a Brexiter of some.
Well, are they?
Yeah.
Is the party faithful? Is it really so pro-Leave?
Well, in surveys of members about the next leader, I think
it's more pro than the Parliamentary Conservative Party.
And that I think plays into Boris Johnson's hands. I think he's still very popular with.
I think he still comes out top, doesn't he?
But it's whether he can get down to the last two amongst MPs. That's not.
And don't forget, you're saying that we think the EU withdrawal bill won't get through or Brexit might not happen. It's ready-made then for a sort of hardline leaver to blame all that on the EU and say we're not leaving because we've been betrayed by the saboteurs, by Brussels.
That's what I mean. I don't think it lances the boil. No. I think what happens is it just gets worse. Because the difficulty is that there are the people who are Brexiteers. It's a sort of religion for them. They are very fundamentalist in that religion. Is that unless it's a perfect break, they will find it very difficult to describe it as anything other than.
It's like Brian was saying before. It's like it's the panacea for everything.
Exactly.
So
referendums never lance the boil. Though,
no, they don't. They just make more division.
You shouldn't have them.
To answer your last point, Kevin, about what happens if there's a Remainer in the final two and have they got any chance? I think at the moment no. But if it wasn't for another 5 years and we've left the EU and that process is seen to be over and past history really, then Amber Rudd, she has a strong chance because Brexit isn't the primary task anymore. If Brexit is still the main thing, you know, the Remainer hasn't got a chance. But so Amber Rudd, for instance, she doesn't want a leadership contest tomorrow. She wants one in 4 or 5 years' time for that reason. But there's a queue of Brexiteers as well, you know, alongside Boris and DD, and most mystifyingly, in my opinion, Dominic Raab seems to have risen up the ranks, and
he does get mentioned. Yeah. James Cleverley's another one.
Yeah, Cleverley, who I can see the appeal of Cleverley. Dominic Raab seems to me a sort of, he's a bit of a kind of Tory version of Keir Starmer in that he's quite sort of solid and competent and quite a good-looking guy, but also quite boring.
Harsh.
I was filling that in as you went,
and we think that Jeremy, I mean, he's the safest.
He will, well, as long as he wants to be leader of the Labour Party, he'll be leader of it, and Labour will lose and lose and lose again.
Turned over at some point.
Brian,
well, death will.
So we've got a big election, not just, you know, talking about elections, not just in this country, but we've got the German election coming up later this year, which is obviously going to, I think, be quite influential in terms of Brexit. How's that shaping up?
Well, I mean, in many ways, I think the result, I think it's very clear that Angela Merkel will win substantially over Martin Schulz. So, in one respect, people might think it's business as usual. Yeah? Germany at the helm of certainly the European Council, and strong support throughout Europe from the kind of centre-right. The Christian Democrat, very pro EU legislation, very pro rights, yet with a kind of fear of foreigners, like a lot of countries. But the key, I think, the key difference here is the rise of the right. We were discussing this earlier. Is it the right or the left? The AfD, the extreme. Right, they're seen in Germany, they could win up to 40 seats, we think, is it? 12-13% of the vote. But it's not your traditional extreme right, because a lot of the people that are currently arguing and supporting that party are from the not even the extreme left, but from the left. So there's, again, it's the issue of migration, of immigration, it's the issue of jobs locally. As you know, Germany's a very federated country, so there's a lot of power in its regions, and there is a fear in Germany of losing that kind of those jobs, those rights that everybody worked hard for post-war. You know, the Germans feel they've worked extremely hard in the last 50 years to get where they are. You saw it through the Greek crisis as well, where there was a lot of animosity towards bailing out Greece. From just
not unlike the UKIP vote in the, outside of London at the last election and at the time of the referendum, that it was all of those issues which I think were driving the real Leave vote. I think that it's that rather than necessarily a great appeal of the thought behind Brexit.
It seems that these days that the traditional sort of left-right political spectrum has just been sort of torn up, hasn't it?
Well, I think also there's a middle ground where, like the SPD in Germany, you know, Martin Schulz is an intelligent, smart man. No, people would vote for him in any other party. If he was the leader of the CDU, they'd be flocking to vote for him. There's not a lot between him and Merkel. Yeah? So, you know, it opens up a gap for other factions, and I think there is a gap in people are not talking about the issues that are concerning them. A bit like in the UK, a bit like how UKIP came in.
I just think the traditional parties across the whole of Europe, including Britain, haven't really worked out how to respond to the financial crisis and the effect of the tighter budgets and essentially the threats and insecurity that people feel in their jobs and their working life.
The factors that drove Brexit.
Absolutely, and that's really, I think,
and the fact that Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, no, I think it's exactly the same thing.
Anti-establishment.
Yeah, exactly. You know, if you look at what happened in Spain, you look at what happened in Greece, you look at, you know, right the way in Italy, right the way across Europe, the traditional political parties have been challenged by elements of the right and the left. Because it's quite easy to make an appeal when people feel insecure, an appeal which is simplistic.
Yes.
And the simple answers are foreigners or nationalisation or any of those things and anything in between. And it's trying to get a political currency that works with the public, that the media will actually report, that I think the centre ground is really having problems with.
But in the UK, the out-of-touch elite was seen as the EU.
Yeah.
Well, in Germany, the out-of-touch elite is not the EU,
No.
it's nationally. It's the SPD
Yeah,
and CDU.
it's others. Isn't it? That's the thing. It's always others.
There's always the others.
Yeah, it's the others, and whether the others are immigrants or whether they're the establishment, they are the problem.
And bring it back to this country, one of the main sort of emblems, I guess, of austerity and the reaction to the financial crisis has been the public sector pay cap, the squeeze on budgets in the public sector and big spending cuts. We've seen some movement in the last week on public sector, the pay cap being incrementally at least raised. Now the unions say it's not enough, it's still a real terms cut. I mean, how significant do you think it is that the government appears to be making some moves at least on increasing public sector wages?
I think what's significant is that it's only part of the government that's making the move. I think we're getting briefings from Number 10 that this is going to happen. But when we hear the detail of the announcement, it's the pay is going to be taken from within existing budgets. So it sounds like Hammond and the Treasury are not really on board with actually unpicking austerity. They're kind of trying to have a political announcement. Cynically, you could say this was announced last week when it was the TUC conference and Dave Corbyn's speech, and he was talking about pay and austerity anyway. So we have this announcement on that day, which is actually almost seems like it's designed to please no one because it's a below inflation rise from within existing budgets, and the unions immediately reject it. So it doesn't feel to me like they've got a significant strategy yet or an answer to the concerns about austerity.
I know that Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland has said that they will lift the pay cap up there. Have they said at what level they'll pitch it at? Is it an inflation rise or is it just more than 1%?
I think they have. I think it's just more than 1%. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the programme for government, I mean, it was at the same time as Corbyn's speech, was that initially you felt, God, this is they are moving to the left with this. Get rid of the pay freeze. We're talking about citizens' income, which has been a fringe issue now suddenly on the political agenda. And afterwards, everybody had to sit back and go, and how will this be paid for? Maybe we'll need Boris Johnson's £350 million a week, because there'll be Barnett consequentials. But I think that's the big thing. So in Scotland, there's now this debate going to happen about tax. And as you know, you don't go into an election talking about raising taxes. But the problem remains that the sums don't really add up in Scotland.
I think ultimately the big call on the Exchequer isn't going to be public sector pay. It's going to be the effect of the decision to leave the European Union, because that is going to be vastly expensive. Not just in terms of the money that we will require to be paid into the European Union as part of this divorce deal, but just the cost in terms of the pressure on jobs and therefore on welfare payments. And you sort of, you look, how the hell do we replace what's happening in farming and agriculture?
Because I thought that coming out of the EU was going to save us £350
a week. No, I think on the payments, the OBR they've budgeted, haven't they, 30 billion, I think it is, that they're expecting the government will be paying in transition or in payments in some sort. And I think you're right, there's going to be a cost, not just in jobs outside of the public sector, but in the public sector. We're going to be bringing work back from Europe. We're going to have, Chris Skidmore said, 20 new public bodies to replicate the functions that Europe does now. And we can see the civil service has actually been rising in the last 3 or 4 quarters, and they've had a third more temporary and consultant staff.
But the economy is going to contract as a result of
and so we're going to need more public sector, contracting economy, both of those things. But I think I agree with that, but there's also another longer-term pressure, which is the ageing population. That's been there before. That's not going to go away.
And but also the people that are servicing that, the health and social care industry, are often coming from outside our own country and are not being paid high wages. That's going to have to be dealt with.
So you've got a
but there's all these problems
economy
that are just being ignored because Brexit's just sucking life out of the public sector in the political debate. There's technology, automation, how that's going to affect the job market. There's these huge challenges that over the next decade
Nobody's
are going
talking
to
about that,
revolutionise.
So demands on the Exchequer are rising exponentially. With pay, an element, fair enough. But there's no suggestion that the tax base is extending.
No.
It's probably
It's
contracting.
reduced. Yeah.
And so I think we...
At the time we were supposed to still be trying to bring down our debts.
Exactly. So there's no real argument.
Employment's gone up, but the tax
precisely.
take has gone down.
Nothing has changed for the good.
Yeah.
In terms of the public purse.
Oh, this is depressing.
Well, on that,
that's why
really,
there's drink.
On that really cheery
There's always drink.
we appear to have gone full circle and come back to Brexit, so we've got a good idea to end at that point. We'll start talking about Brexit again. Just to say, thanks very much for watching. To stay up to date with the latest political developments from across Europe, please log on to www.dodsgroup.com, where you can subscribe to our briefings and newsletters. Thanks for watching.